Voy a presentar al último y tercer ponente de esta mañana. Nuestro tercer ponente es el doctor Stuart Allan, profesor de periodismo en la Media School de la Universidad de Bournemouth, en el Reino Unido, donde también es director del Centro de Investigación en Periodismo y Comunicación. Actualmente investiga los usos que los ciudadanos hacen de las imágenes digitales cuando escriben noticias, a la hora de producir noticias. Y hoy nos hablará del periodismo digital como servicio público, haciendo referencia sobre todo a los testimonios de los ciudadanos. So, Professor Allan, the floor is yours.
There we are. Okay, gracias. Okay, thank you. May I begin by thanking Arati and the other organizing committee members for their very kind invitation to participate and for their remarkable efforts in organizing this event on our behalf. Judging from the papers that we've heard so far today, it's obvious to me that we are set for a fascinating couple of days of challenging engagements and lively discussion. Okay, well, I'm mindful of the time, and I've been given permission to kind of stray past 1:30, but at the same time, I know people's stomachs will start to grumble before too long. So I think what I'll probably do is trim things down a little bit as we go, which is only appropriate in light of the kinds of issues we've been discussing about today. So perhaps a little bit more of an impromptu performance. Perhaps I may begin by posing a question. What does it mean to bear witness in a moment of crisis? Most journalists have been formally trained to be dispassionately impartial when documenting what they see, hear, and feel under such circumstances, recognizing as they do that the truth value of their chosen rendering of facts will be at stake. For the ordinary individual, however, any sense of journalism is likely to be far from their mind should they find themselves unexpectedly caught up in disturbing events rapidly unfolding around them. Nevertheless, they may well strive to engage in a form of eyewitness reportage, perhaps using their mobile telephone to capture an image, generate a video, or craft a tweet in order to record and share their personal experience of what is happening in front of them. Such spontaneous, spur-of-the-moment responses, so often motivated by a desire to connect with distant others, go to the heart of current debates about citizen journalism, one of the most challenging issues confronting the news media today. And I've lost my, oh, there it is. Over recent years, there has been no shortage of crisis events that have figured in appraisals of the changing nature of the relationship between professional journalism and its amateur citizen-led alternatives. For those welcoming citizen journalism and its scope for recasting long-standing repertorial principles, a paradigm shift appears to be underway. Traditional news coverage with its he said, she said formulaic appeals to objectivity, over-reliance on official sources, and dry, distancing, lecture-like mode of address is looking increasingly anachronistic. Too often it is bland, its notions of fairness and balance contrived, even off-putting in its preoccupation with the esoteric world of elites. Citizen journalism, in marked contrast, inspires a language of democratization. Journalism by the people, for the people, is to be heralded for its alternative norms, values, and priorities. It is raw, immediate, independent, and unapologetically subjective, making the most of the resources of web-based initiatives such as collective intelligence, crowdsourcing, wiki collaboration, and the like, within and across diverse, evolving virtual communities to connect, interact, and share first-hand, unauthorized forms of journalistic activity promising fresh perspectives. For critics, however, citizen journalism's dangers outweigh whatever merits might temporarily catch the eye, with news organizations at serious risk of losing credibility in their rush to embrace forms of reporting they cannot always independently confirm or verify is accurate. Citizen journalism may be cheap and popular, hence its not inconsiderable appeal for cash-strapped newsrooms. But in a world where facts matter, ethical codes warrant respect, and audience trust is paramount, it continues to spark intense debate about how best to negotiate its benefits and hazards alike. Here we might pause then and pose a rather flippant question that goes to the heart of this debate, where news imagery comes to the fore. If everyone equipped with a camera phone can be a photojournalist, then who needs photojournalism? Here it's possible to discern a continuum of sorts, with voices proclaiming photojournalism's imminent demise on the one end, and those heralding its dramatic rebirth on the other end. Voices situated in between these stark polarities include those calling for a new economic model to reaffirm its viability, even though the means by which such a model is to be secured remain frustratingly elusive. Now, regardless of where one is situated along this continuum, it is readily apparent that photojournalism is being decisively transformed across fluidly uneven digital contexts in ways that raise important questions for civic engagement in public life. Many newsrooms, under intense financial pressure to trim expenditure wherever possible, regard the resources vital for photojournalism to be a luxury increasingly difficult to justify. As a result, the very integrity of photojournalism as a professional craft risks being compromised, many fear, when its guiding tenets and principles threaten to collapse in a climate of managerial indifference, even outright hostility. Let's turn to a very recent case in point to illustrate this. We turn to the United States and the Chicago Sun-Times, and the individual image you see there is Bob Kotelek, who recently died earlier this year, 29th of May, at the age of 87. He had been a former chief photographer for the Chicago Sun-Times. And according to the newspaper's obituary for him, Bob Kotelek began his career in 1942. A teenager at the time, his part-time job was to clean out the loft built for pigeons on the newspaper building's roof. Now you might ask, why in the world would the newspaper employ someone to clean out the lofts of pigeons up on the roof? Well, they were homing pigeons, and they were trained to ferry rolls of film shot elsewhere in the city, not least at sporting events, back to the newspaper. Now, over the course of the years to follow, Kotelek rose through the ranks of Sun-Times photographers, earning a reputation for fearless determination. His obituary in the Sun-Times notes that he chronicled movie stars such as Marilyn Monroe and horrific tragedies, becoming the paper's chief photographer. One of his former colleagues, John H. White, is quoted in the obit as remembering, quote, "He had a knack for news and an extra sense of anticipating what was going to happen. He knew that you could never publish an excuse, so he always produced." So, a professional life well lived, it would seem. However, in a rather bitter twist of irony, on the same day that the Sun-Times website posted the obit about Bob Kotelek, startling news was breaking within the newspaper itself. An email alert had gone out to the 28 full-time members of the photography staff to attend the mandatory meeting at 9:30 a.m. that day. The meeting turned out to be rather short, lasting less than a minute. Managing editor Jim Kirk told them the company was moving in a direction of more multimedia. So the tough decision had been taken to cut the entire photography staff. And there's the newspaper's executive's public statement, and that's it in full. And perhaps it's the last sentence there which is most important. The Chicago Sun-Times continues to evolve with our digitally savvy customers, and as a result, we have had to restructure the way we manage multimedia, including photography, across the network. So certainly a perception there of the relative activity of its audience members. Meanwhile, the assembled group of stunned photographers and photo editors, amongst them Pulitzer Prize winner John H. White, who was quoted in the obit, that's him in the middle there, were told to complete the paperwork for their layoff packages, return their company-owned camera equipment, and surrender their access badges. Within hours of the announcement, rumors were circulating on social media sites that Sun-Times reporters would be undergoing training in iPhone photography basics in order to supplement the work of freelance photographers wherever possible. Now, as you might imagine, initial reactions from across the mediascape ranged from the incredulous to the appalled, soon giving way to the scathing. Commentators pointed out that there was much more to photojournalism than equipping journalists with cameras. Reporters, several of them noted, are, in general, terrible at taking pictures. Photographs snapped on iPhones by photographically inept reporters would be a disaster, many predicted. The decision to sack the entire photography staff, it was pointed out time and time again, revealed a shocking level of disrespect for both journalists and readers. And there's we won't go into it there, but that gives you a sort of a snapshot of the kind of citizen imagery which is coming to the fore. Well, shortly thereafter, a matter of weeks, we turned to what was happening in Boston on a rather sad and tragic day of April 15th, when this whole question of the difference between the professional and the amateur news photographer was thrown into sharp relief. Here I might begin with this image, which was shot by John Tamaki, who is a Boston Globe photojournalist. And as he later recalled, and I quote, "I was covering the finish line at ground level of the marathon. Everything was going on as usual. It was jovial. People were happy, clapping, and getting to a point where it gets a little boring as a photographer. And then we heard this explosion." What had been an ordinary day in Tamaki's more than 30-year career photographing city events was shockingly transformed into an extraordinary one. The percussion of the bomb blast threw his camera gear into the air, yet he barely hesitated in his response. Quote, "My instinct was, no matter what it is, you're a photographer first. That's what you're doing." I ran towards the explosion, towards the police. They had their guns drawn. It was pandemonium. Nobody knew what was going on. End of quote. Amidst the turmoil swirling around him, the first thing I saw, he said, were people's limbs being blown off. Tamaki did his best to document the scene while keeping his emotions in check. Rendered temporarily speechless, eyes swelling up behind my camera, he said, his shoes covered in blood from walking on the sidewalk, taking pictures. He persevered best he was able. At one point in the confusion, he remembered, a cop came to me, grabbed me, and said, "Do me a favor, do not exploit the situation." And that resonated with me, he said. I can't think about it. I got to keep doing what I'm doing. Now, Tamaki was one of several professional photojournalists who found themselves abruptly pressed into service to capture the grisly horrors of what breaking news coverage was calling a war zone erupting in the city. Amongst them were fellow citizens seizing the moment to bear witness from their vantage point along the street. Their responses and images, relayed via social networking sites such as Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Flickr, Instagram, Reddit, and Vine, amongst many others, represented personal, impromptu contributions to real-time reportage. And there's all kinds of examples Here, this is that of Bruce Mendelsohn, who's a PR consultant. He was in a party looking out over the race. His brother, I believe, had just completed the race, and they were celebrating. And suddenly, as he said, the building shuddered. I saw smoke. I smelled cordite. He said, I'm a veteran, so I know what that stuff smells like. I know what that stuff sounds like. And he raced to the scene to help out wherever he could with what was happening. And when he returned to the office afterwards, he took this image, which was discovered by the Associated Press on his Twitter feed, and in turn was widely distributed. And in many ways, that was very typical of a number of people who found themselves playing this kind of impromptu role of accidental photojournalists. They were there to document the event for the benefit of themselves and friends and family and so forth, who suddenly realized that the kind of imagery that they were capturing was of a much wider and greater public service. This is an image taken by a college student, Daniel Lamparello, who was situated about 200 feet from the finish line. He was there to cheer on his aunt and uncle, who were both running in the marathon. And he took this image, which literally about 10 seconds after the explosion. It was spotted by Reuters' social media editor and promptly retweeted to his extensive followers, and through a whole process of going viral, became one of the most iconic images of the crisis. Now, if you look at that image to the left, up close, you see, if it's sort of blown up large enough, you can see that it revealed what was called the lone figure on the roof of an adjacent building, which invited intense speculation across the social media scape. A tweet asking, "Who is that guy on the roof?" went viral, while Boston Marathon roof was soon trending on Twitter worldwide. Such was the public interest in delving through crowdsourced imagery in search of clues about the crime's perpetrators. Some of those involved, going over these images with almost forensic-like intensity, were dubbed amateur photo sleuths by the press, although fears were also expressed about online vigilantes, digital witch hunts, and conspiracy nuts, and so forth. The sheer scope and diversity of eyewitness citizen reportage of the Boston attacks were currently described as a critical turning point in media commentaries. In the case of the BBC News, it contended that this was, quote, the first atrocity to be covered in real time for a mass audience on social media, end of quote. Not surprisingly, in the ensuing deluge of material, however, evidence of the perils engendered by misleading rumors, lapses in judgment, and outright disinformation attracts severe criticism. Some critics complain that unleashing amateurs was dangerous, that we need new social norms to protect us from them. And here, several choice phrases were typical. It was called "me first journalism," unsubstantiated amateur footage, mass photo dumps, unreliable crowdsourced material, amongst other more colorful objections. Pointed ethical questions arose regarding how some news organizations were striving to compete with their citizen media rivals to be first with a scoop or fresh angle, including with respect to their appropriation of imagery without independent verification. One of the most notorious examples being this one, which was the New York Post front page story, which has almost become sort of a symbolic representation of what a rush to judgment looks like. The two young men depicted in the full page photo, as it turned out, were innocent bystanders. In the eyes of some, however, the very legitimacy of citizen photo reportage was morally problematic. Quote, "You're not a journalist just because you have your smartphone in your pocket and can take pictures of someone who has just had their legs blown off and their life shattered," was a widely quoted comment made on Facebook, which prompted considerable debate in the blogosphere. Further criticisms revolved around assertions made about the callousness of individuals too busy taking images of victims to lend assistance. the prospect of media celebrity allegedly proving impossible to resist. Some accused them of actually getting in the way of the emergency workers responding on the scene. Some worried about the emotional effectivity such disturbing imagery might engender among vulnerable publics, while others expressed concerns that such depictions of carnage and panic were fulfilling the perpetrator's narcissistic desire for notoriety, possibly even inviting copycat responses as a result. Evidence in support of these and related claims was seldom cited beyond hearsay, nor did the individual participants' relative investment in self-identifying as journalists tend to be made apparent. And that's an important point that Teresa made in her presentation. In any case, such graphic imagery was firmly defended by others, perhaps most resolutely by those counterposing it against visually sanitized treatments repeated over and over again by corporate media. The politics of filtering proved contentious in further ways, perhaps most markedly with regard to certain perceived transgressions of photojournalism's normative limits, typically expressed in a subjunctive language of good taste, public decency, or personal privacy. A case in point was, that's a further example there of citizen imagery. This is a case in point, was imagery also widely regarded to be iconic. The New York Times called it this image a searing symbol of the attacks, which shows spectator Jeff Bowman in a wheelchair being rushed from the scene, the best part of both legs ripped away. And I apologize for the graphic and grisly nature of that image. Certainly, the existence of this image posed interesting questions for news organizations striving to uphold their own kind of sense of what was appropriate to represent and what wasn't. Several went with a cropped version to exclude the appearance of protruding bone matter from what was left of his legs. Other news organizations imposed a black bar to conceal the more gruesome details. Still others employed pixelation for cautionary purposes. Some blurred Bowman's face out of respect for his privacy, pointing out that he was in a very vulnerable situation and was otherwise fully identifiable. Other news organizations opted to pixelate his legs instead, considering the nature of their damage too upsetting to disclose. A related concern with the depiction of victims arose where the use of digital manipulation was concealed, thereby calling into question image integrity at the level of perceived truthfulness. A case in point occurred when a reader spotted a discrepancy between one of John Tomaki's photographs, which we have in front of you here, posted on the Boston Globe's Big Picture blog, and the version of it published by the New York Daily News on its front page the next day. As you may be able to tell looking at the images there, you'll see that close scrutiny reveals that the image's record of a woman's broken leg has been carefully adjusted to obscure the broken, bloodied bone emerging above her ankle. Numerous commentators weighed into the emergent debate about the acceptable limits of Photoshop. Initially refusing to comment on its editorial decision-making, the Daily News eventually released a statement. I can read it in its entirety. It said, quote, "The Daily Mail's edited that photo out of sensitivity to the victims, the families, and the survivors. There were far more gory photos that the paper chose not to run, and frankly, I think the rest of the media should have been as sensitive as the Daily News." And of course, there were a lot of comments on online sites that kind of engaged with precisely this issue of the relative capacity of visual journalism to reflect, that is to say, reflect and not construct a reality revolving around public trust. So-called real news was perceived to be at risk, including where mainstream media's misappropriation of the ordinary submissions by camera-wielding citizens were concerned. Now, implicit here is the apparent authenticity of the ordinary citizens' near-instant uploading of imagery via social media, effectively contrasted with the routines of institutional processing, intrinsically biased or ideologically motivated in the eyes of some, enacted by their professional counterparts. For those inclined to consider avowed commitments to objective reportage contrived or self-serving, spontaneous citizen engagement and unapologetically subjective newsmaking and its impassioned distribution via retweets and shares may well be deemed to provide a truer image of what is really happening on the ground. We should probably have that word truer in quotation marks. Moreover, in praising members of the public for gathering, interpreting, and sharing visual evidence, particularly when so much of it proved distressing, is to recognize in such activities a repertorial role that invites further reflection about the professional's corresponding responsibilities during times of crisis. Disputes over what counts as photojournalism and who qualifies to be a photojournalist are hardly new, of course. But there's little doubt that the Boston crisis highlighted the extent to which photo editors found themselves relying upon imagery shot by non-professionals. The very amateurness of citizen imagery tempers normalized conventions of journalistic authority. Its up-close affirmation of presence, I am here, and this is what it means to be there, intimately intertwining time, space, and place to claim an emotional, often poignant purchase. Managing this proliferation of imagery invited fresh thinking about how best to perform a curatorial role, one consistent with professional standards and procedures, while at the same time benefiting from the news value associated with the raw, visceral immediacy of citizen witnessing. Now, I had another example for you, but which happened a couple of weeks later in London, where tragically a soldier, that's him up in the right-hand corner there, 25-year-old soldier Lee Rigby was attacked in the street and killed by two assailants, both of whom then, having murdered him in broad daylight in front of many startled onlookers, actually invited the people who were there to document what they were doing and stood and waited for the police to arrive, trying to explain and justify what they had done. And of course, as a result, using the kind of material which had been generated by people on their mobile telephones, found themselves on the front page of the newspaper. When the police arrived, both of them were shot, but survived and are currently going through the legal process. Now, many people, of course, were furious with the way that the media responded to this particular crisis, saying that, in effect, they had, succeeded in their attempt to get their message across, that, in effect, Muslims were being slaughtered in Afghanistan, and this was simply Britain, in effect, getting a taste of its own medicine. The newspapers, of course, responded and said that they were editorially justified, that arguments that they'd in effect turned him into a poster boy for Al-Qaeda were unfair, that they were simply documenting in all of its grisly detail precisely what had happened, and that's nothing more than what people would expect. And of course, we saw a number of examples of other citizens being involved, sending tweets and so forth. This is by a young fellow who's a rapper, who kind of documents in a stream of tweets precisely the event as he was watching it. The video footage. There's a list of them there. It's quite a vivid account, shall we say. And of course, the media were very quick to kind of take up and use any kind of material which ordinary citizens were providing them in order to document what was happening, creating, in the process of doing so, a whole series of debates which unfolded on the blogosphere. Images such as this one with the slain soldier in the background being seen to be much more offensive than many of the other more graphic ones in the eyes of some critics, and so forth. When it was broadcast on television, of course, it invited a similar kind of response. And there again, it was the issue that everything seemed to hinge upon as to whether or not revealing this kind of imagery to the public was consistent with the public interest. And it is that discourse of the public interest, which of course journalistically justifies certain kinds of repertorial engagement, which would otherwise be seen to be perhaps morally or ethically problematic in the eyes of some, but such is the rather robust response from most journalists that this is simply them performing their societal duty, that the debate very quickly becomes very polarized. The television news organizations hedge things a little bit by not revealing the material until after 9 p.m., which in the UK is sort of seen as the watershed by which time children, theoretically at least, are no longer watching television, and they in turn can then show more adult content. A few days later, despite this debate and the fact that it had raged for several days over what was right to show or not, when this bit of material came to light of the police actually shooting the two assailants, it was right back on the front page and everyone was using the video again, just as if that moral discussion and debate hadn't actually taken place before. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so I'll maybe take another 5 minutes to sort of wrap up, and then we can open things up for questions. Okay, thank you. So, in looking across the reportage of these two events, which took place earlier this year, the Boston Marathon bombings in April and the murder of a soldier on the street in Woolwich, London, in May, I return to this issue of how the social contingencies of professional and citizen witnessing are blurred in the world of social media. Both of these events, I would argue, demonstrate in different ways why the lived materiality of witnessing, the intrinsic value of being there, is the linchpin of good reporting. Viewed from the perspective of the news media, the capacity of the professional journalist to serve as a trustworthy, reliable witness in the heat of the moment, and also, crucially, to negotiate the terms delimiting the eyewitnessing of others, underpins the discursive legitimacy of first-hand reporting for those who are there, as well as for those at a distance, for whom the ensuing coverage is likely to shape perceptions, possibly in a decisive manner. This is a formidable challenge, not least because eyewitnessing is as conditional as it is provisional, and as such fraught with difficulties. The authority of presence, a situational imbrication of here and now, is a precarious achievement, one always at risk of coming unraveled. Such are the tensions besetting human understanding, interpretation, and memory. Somewhat paradoxically, however, it is this invocation of eyewitness subjectivity that throws into crisp relief the codified strictures of journalistic objectivity. The proclaimed capacity of the journalistic gaze to be impersonal, detached, and dispassionate in its purview is a tacit yet telling feature of the professional ethos of impartiality. The journalist as people's witness, steadfastly committed to eyewitness fidelity to what he or she saw and heard, should not waver when bearing witness on our behalf. Witnessing necessarily involves a complex process of mediation, despite rhetorical claims about facts speaking for themselves in journalistic parlance. It is unpacking this process of mediation, however, that we encounter the contrary, some might even say counter-hegemonic at the risk of sounding old-fashioned, discourses of citizen journalism. News organizations willing to revision their role anew, namely by making the most of this potential to forge collaborative relationships between professionals and their citizen counterparts, will secure new opportunities to reinvent photojournalism at a time of considerable skepticism about its future prospects. Which returns us to the plight of the Chicago Sun-Times photography staff I discussed at the outset, and that's them there on the picket line, staff members. And the closure of the department having taken place weeks after the Boston and London crisis, sharply underscoring why this reinvention of the craft is so important. In Sun-Times photojournalist John H. White's case, that's him pictured there on the bottom right, It was a 35-year career on the newspaper that came to an abrupt end. Yet he made every effort to remain positive. Quote, "There's no place in my heart for anger. I'm hurt, sure, I'm human. I'm disappointed, but I don't curse darkness. I light candles," he said in an interview afterwards. Photojournalism was not about him, but rather about helping others, he believed, particularly those struggling to cope with everyday hardships, such as in impoverished inner-city neighborhoods. "We're part of and we cover the heartbeat of humanity," he continued. "That's going to suffer." Photographers' personal presence in these local communities, their informal contacts and networks giving shape and direction to Sun-Times coverage, is vitally important and yet recurrently overlooked when managers focus their attention on cost structures quantified on financial balance sheets. In White's words, it was as if they pushed a button and deleted a whole culture of photojournalism. Humanity is being robbed by people with money on their minds. End of quote. To close then, my paper today has aimed to highlight several vantage points from which to assess the challenges confronting photojournalism as it evolves in contested circumstances. Very few of citizen photojournalism's most passionate advocates would contend that it is a replacement for the role of the professional. And yet its merits must embolden photojournalists to speak with clarity and conviction about what this role means today, and to revisit questions regarding how it may be enhanced in the name of public service. We need to be alert to the prospects for refashioning photojournalism so as to create spaces for citizen witnessing, while at the same time recognizing how these opportunities will be conditioned by negotiated compromises wrought by institutional pressures and priorities. In seeking to move debates about how best to enliven photojournalism's future beyond the soaring rhetoric of advocates and critics alike, the importance of developing this collaborative, cooperative ethos of connectivity becomes ever more pressing. And at exactly 1:30, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Allan, for this presentation and for keeping the time too. ¿Tenéis alguna pregunta? ¿Algún comentario? Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you very, very much for this presentation. I have three things to say. One is about digital journalism as, in a certain sense, competing with citizenship, good citizenship, in the sense that many times we see people, for example, in front of a car accident, they make a video. They don't go there to help people and, you know, to call for the ambulance and no, they take the picture. So the desire to document reality becomes more important than being a good citizen, because being a good citizen requires to go there and help immediately first. So there is these things that we notice a lot of time and make us thinking about and problematizing this fact, because you know, journalists or a reporter does this because this is the profession, and this is the first requirement from him. But for people, the first requirement is to go there and help. And So this is really a question mark that I have on these kind of things. And then a reflection about I love this picture you show, Guardian's witness, inviting people to share with them, which means that citizen journalism, we journalism, what you like to call it, is not in a position, but it is complementary to traditional press. So we often we like to see it as an alternative, but I think that the best citizen journalism can produce is, to somehow work together with. And another thing I was reflecting about is this, what they said, Chicago Sun-Times audiences are constantly seeking videos, images, photographs, which is not true. So a lot of research on online newspapers show that people don't have the time to go and look at the videos and look at the materials that newspaper gives, offers. They don't do that. So I was thinking about that, because sometimes it is a stereotype that we have, that people are seeking, image, video, things like that. And the last thing I was thinking is about an ambiguity about which we should reflect a lot. So when we are in the photographs studies, okay, photography studies, we are very, how do you say, we don't think that the picture represents reality, but the picture is, a kind of approach to reality, a kind of perspective on reality from the person who took the picture. So there is, instead, when pictures arrive in newspapers before, and now in digital journalism, in citizen journalism, etc., what happens? That the picture is offered, is given as an evidence of the reality, which is not true. It is, so there is a long story about that, about the history of picture and all this problematic of the picture not being an evidence for the reality. But all this debate is in a certain sense forgot. And so in this kind of other setting, of other fields of studies, we look at these things with a danger of naivety, as this would be, which is not. So I would like to have Stuart Allan reflection about these problems.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of really interesting points there that deserve more time than I can give them here. But I'll just touch on a couple of points, if I may. Certainly the issue of citizenship is an excellent way into exploring these issues, I think. Quite often, I think, in the discourse around citizen journalism, we're sort of focusing on the notion of journalism, quite rightly, but possibly in danger of overlooking the extent to which citizenship itself, or the citizen in citizen photojournalism, is itself problematic. Here, I always think we need to kind of reverse that logic a little bit and think about not only the citizen as journalist, but also the journalist as citizen, and what that entails. That then, of course, speaks to the larger utility of the concept of citizen journalism, which I think you've quite rightly touched on. The notion itself, in terms of its etymology, more or less emerges in the aftermath of the tsunami in 2004, early 2005. That's the point at which it enters journalism's vocabulary as an explicit concept. But I would argue that citizen journalism is as old as journalism is, that ever since we've had a conception of the journalist as a distinct role to be occupied, whether or not it's a profession, trade, craft, or any other kind of terminology you might want to use to describe it. It nevertheless has consistently prefigured the non-journalist, that is to say the amateur, the pretender who aspires to that kind of status but isn't seen to warrant it, isn't seen to be sufficiently legitimate. And of course that is often an intrinsically political set of issues and debates as well, which is why, and I hesitate to mention a book, but the most recent book that I've written, Citizen Witnessing, is an attempt to kind of get past that by actually just say, well, perhaps we're asking too much of the concept of citizen journalism. And given that so few of the people involved actually self-identify as journalists and have at best sort of ephemeral engagement with journalistic activity, what they really are doing, many of them, is actually wishing to kind of stand in and bear witness on behalf of journalists and members of the public. And so for me, it's so far been sort of a productive line of inquiry to kind of challenge this conception of witnessing. And that to me is more than just description, more than just recording or documenting what's going on, but it's doing so in a purposeful way. And that is to say that it's, and here we could spend the next hour happily unraveling all of this, but it's very much that kind of sense of assuming a representative capacity, standing in for those who are not there in order to represent on their behalf, which raises the issues around visual evidence, which you're quite rightly pointing out, are not new to this kind of phenomenon. Many of them epistemological issues go to the heart of visual imagery. Dare I mention another book, this one I'm actually writing at the moment, looking at war and conflict imagery going right back to the 1840s. You realize that that's been consistent with the development and trajectory of photography right from the outset. And yet so much of this debate is sort of framed as if it's just emerged when the internet arrived. And of course it's a much older, much long-standing set of issues there that are worthy of our attention as we attempt to unravel them. Thank you.
Bueno, si no tenéis más preguntas, igual tenéis más hambre que preguntas, así que nos veremos a las 4 empieza las comunicaciones a la tarde. Los que sois comunicantes, por favor, a las 4 menos cuarto, alrededor de las 4 menos cuarto, si podéis estar aquí para poner los PowerPoint. Y thank you very much, Stuart.